It's really going to be a really messy, bloody battle to turf him out. And I don't know if the Democrats have got the stomach for that fight. I think Biden, at the moment, seems to be weathering this really intense storm. In fact, he seems to be in slight denial about it. He really didn't offer that many concessions to his critics in the press conference. He said he was going to pace himself a bit better when he was asked about reports that he wasn't going to schedule anything after 8 p.m. in the evening. But aside from that, he blamed his staff for overloading him. He blamed the polls for being inaccurate, said he's got better polls of his own. In almost Trumpian fashion, actually. That's the kind of Donald Trump playbook.
So, David, first of all, what's your assessment of how Joe Biden did in what was seen very much as a big test for him in this press conference?
So in the press conference, I think he did okay. My assessment was, and I was sitting there in the room, was that he obviously made one or two gaffes. One gaffe in particular where the name Trump popped out as vice president when he was supposed to be saying Harris, and he just didn't clock it at all until a journalist at the end asked him about it. He hadn't even realized he'd substituted the name of Trump for Harris at all. And there was a bit of a gasp in the room when he did it, because it was a feeling of, oh, here we go again. Because really the biggest gaffe of the day was when he switched up Zelensky's name for Putin. He introduced Zelensky as President Putin. And I mean, that's right at the end of this NATO summit in Washington on home turf, where he's really in his comfort zone. Bit like the press conference, he was for most of it really in his comfort zone, and he did pretty well. He showed his grasp of foreign affairs, his deep interest in it, lots of long, slightly soporific answers about international problems in the Middle East and with China, etc., etc. And he really enjoys doing that, and he's very fluent at and lucid, seemingly, at doing that. It was a different guy to the disastrous debate. But the only thing, or the main thing, that a lot of people are going to be talking about in the morning are these two gaffes. I'm afraid for him, he's put his foot in it again. It's pure Joe Biden. You can't get you never get a Joe Biden press conference or speech without some kind of flub, and that's been true not just for the last 3 years. That's been true for the last 50 years, to be honest. So in many ways, it was vintage Joe Biden.
Do you get a sense that things are changing? I mean, I keep looking at the number of Democrats and people in Congress who are coming out saying that he should step aside. Do you think we're reaching a tipping point, or do you get a sense that Biden is going to see this out?
So it's really hard to know exactly how it's going to play out now. I was beginning to feel earlier today that we had reached this tipping point and there was no going back for the Democratic Party. There was enough of a movement and enough disquiet in the ranks for them to make this putsch, if you like, and get rid of Biden, somehow persuade him to step aside. But just seeing him tonight, or just seeing him last night, he was absolutely determined to carry on. He's absolutely convinced in his own ability and his own importance, and that he's the best candidate to take on and defeat Donald Trump. But it's really going to be a really messy, bloody battle to turf him out. And I don't know if the Democrats have got the stomach for that fight. I think Biden, at the moment, seems to be weathering this really intense storm. In fact, he seems to be in slight denial about it. He really didn't offer that many concessions to his critics in the press conference. He said he was going to pace himself a bit better when he was asked about reports that he wasn't going to schedule anything after 8 p.m. in the evening. Aside from that, he blamed his staff for overloading him. He blamed the polls for being inaccurate, said he's got better polls of his own. in almost Trumpian fashion, actually. That's the kind of Donald Trump playbook.
Gosh. Do you think, I mean, we always talk about perception versus reality, and often in politics, it almost doesn't matter what the reality is. If the perception is such amongst voters that Biden is not capable and everyone's just looking for the next gaffe, I just wonder if the Democrats do stick with him, whether they can change this narrative before November.
Well, the thing is, Biden has a lot of control in his own hands because he's won the party primary. So he controls the vast majority of the delegates going to the party convention next month, who are duty bound, if not exactly legally bound, to vote for him when it comes to confirming the nominee. Now, as he said in his press conference tonight, as he said in his press conference last night, these delegates could break with him and vote their own way to try and block him. It was similar to the challenge that he issued a couple of days ago, where he said, "Well, if anyone thinks they can do a better job, challenge me for the nomination. Challenge me." So he's up for the fight, and the party doesn't have that many official levers to pull. It comes down to the pressure campaign, and we're hearing that perhaps Barack Obama has got his doubts now that Biden can do it. Nancy Pelosi, another grandee, appears to have her own doubts. If these people, and it perhaps would take others as well, were actually to go to Biden and personally plead with him for the sake of America to stand aside, maybe that would do the trick. But at the moment, he and his inner circle seem determined to carry on.
David, that's brilliant. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Shall we start then with President Biden and his press conference at the end of the NATO summit, and in fact a couple of moments towards the end of the NATO summit, all of which was supposed to win over those doubters who for the last couple of weeks and perhaps beyond have been questioning whether he can continue as the Democratic nominee to run against Donald Trump for the presidency. Sir Keir Starmer's dismissed concerns about the president, saying he was on good form when the pair had their own meeting. Jack, let's come to you first of all on this. I mean, we've talked about Joe Biden and his ability in the last couple of weeks after that debate 2 weeks ago. And one thing, just to sort of state the obvious by way of beginning this conversation, it's not gone away. We're 2 weeks on, and one White House aide says, hinging the fate of democracy on each of these pretty spaced-out, unscripted events is exhausting and unsustainable. And it seems this morning it's hard to disagree with that.
I think it also makes the election campaign quite unpredictable as well, and that's bound to be a worry for everybody involved too. I personally think Joe Biden is probably the most qualified, the most experienced president of the United States in decades. I think he's done a really good job on the economy. I think he has provided consistent leadership internationally. But I think he's got a great duty now to realise that this is not sustainable. The election campaign cannot be unpredictable. The stakes are too high. There is too much going on in the world and inside America, and this is not an election to become a member of parliament where you could easily have a by-election next spring and elect somebody else. This is an election for a 4-year term as US president. And Americans do choose, if you look back through recent decades, Americans choose the candidate that they think is strongest and most consistent for their president. If you go back to Clinton versus Bush Sr., Reagan against various Democrats who didn't appear to be the right type for the job. If you go back to even Bush against Gore and Obama against McCain, Americans choose somebody that they believe is the better of the two options in terms of consistency and strength. And I just don't think it's going to happen. And I think he has a great duty now to his party, to his country, to himself and his own legacy. to be the guy who makes sure that somebody else takes over.
That's interesting, isn't it, Nikki? That sort of question that we've kind of been posing throughout the morning is the only way for President Biden to secure anything of a positive legacy to be known and remembered as the one who stood aside.
Well, it is a very difficult personal decision for him and for those around him. And the fact is, we spend a lot of time in the UK saying we don't have a presidential system. I mean, Jack's right. The US, absolutely, it is totally about the personality of the particular individual. And I suppose that the worry is that he stands down. They put in, whether it's Kamala Harris, whether it's one of the other Democratic governors, and of course they lose to Trump. And then what's the legacy? I guess you never know. But equally, putting up somebody who, somebody said, you can't unsee that debate. You can't unsee the mistakes that he's made. And I feel incredibly sorry, because to be honest with you, if any of us were giving a press conference or anything with that world scrutiny, I suspect that we would probably use the wrong name somewhere. But unfortunately, it's becoming a very regular occurrence with Biden. And so, I agree with Jack. I think that it's his duty, but equally it's the duty of those around him. He must have trusted advisors. And as I understand it, Jill Biden is the person that he listens to most. And I think it's very difficult to think how family can want their incredibly experienced, person that they're very proud of having been president, to be subject continue to this scrutiny, and to be in this situation. So the thing they have to do, they have to make the decision quickly. As somebody said, we're still talking, exactly as you said, we're still talking about it's 2 weeks later after debate. It's not going to get any better. They absolutely need to make the decision, the Democrats, very, very fast now.
I think that's interesting because, in theory, we should be talking about what the NATO summit concluded, what the outcomes were. And, part of that is the sort of reporting this morning that NATO members thought they'd kind of achieved enough to Trump-proof. That's the phrase that was used, Trump-proof the alliance, because 23 out of 32 states hit the spending goals of 2% of GDP on defence, and more have set out plans to reach that figure. And that is probably quite an important headline in all of this. But actually, that is completely overshadowed by Biden's performance and these gaffes that have come up yet again, and that in and of itself, Jack, is a dangerous place to be if we're not getting at the real policy issues.
And also, if the Ukrainians are going to win the war against the Russian invasion, probably, despite all the other terrible things that have been happening in the world over the past 12 months, still probably the number one important objective anywhere in the world. For freedom, democracy, and human rights, for the Ukrainians to beat back this invasion. Their morale needs to be high. They need to believe that we will have their back. That if they keep fighting in the trenches, if they keep backing themselves in order to beat this invader, that we will be there for them. And anything that shows a sign of weakness in that, on one side, encourages Putin and the people around him, and on the other side, has an impact on the psychology and the morale of people in Ukraine. So the stakes are really, really high here. I believe they're high for the Democratic Party, they're high for America, but they're also really high elsewhere as well. And that's why I think it is a duty. It's not just a political tactic or, something personal here. There's a duty here to make sure that we are going to be there because this winter again will be tough for the Ukrainians as the Russians gear up with all their dodgy supporters around the world to try and take out the civilian infrastructure of Ukraine.
We spoke earlier to Bob Weiner, who is, a good friend of Joe Biden's, going back many, many years, also used to work at the White House. And he was saying, look, he's made gaffes for years, President Biden. This is just what he does. He kind of gets words mixed up. This is nothing to do with age. What is happening right now is ageism. And he was really eloquent and detailed when he was talking about foreign policy. And the question I put to him is, the problem is that even if he is eloquent and detailed about foreign policy, if the headlines are always about the gaffe, how do you change that political narrative? And I just wonder, Nikki, if it's even possible, if voters are constantly in their mind, it is, well, President Biden, he makes mistakes. They kind of forget everything else. And is there any way, particularly in just 4 months, to turn that around?
I think it is very, very difficult. And I think one of the challenge with politics is that, as you say, you can have all these other very important issues in the world and the need to have those detailed policy discussions. But it's the gaffes or in our case, it was the D-Day events or the betting scandal that just cut through to the public. And they sort of encapsulate in a way what is the problem with a particular candidate or a particular policy stance and everything else. And the trouble is that the longer this goes on, the less scrutiny. I mean, Donald Trump is thoroughly enjoying all of this. I mean, as you saw with the debate, he needs to do absolutely nothing other than stand there and watch as his opponent, does get his words mixed up or, forgets some critical bits of information. I have no doubt that ultimately, Biden, as he said, he knows how to tell right from wrong. He knows how to tell the truth. I suspect that he would absolutely make the right decisions if the moment of crisis, and I would still thoroughly support him making those right decisions rather than Donald Trump. But the trouble is, if it cuts through to the public, for whom many of whom are not engaged in politics at all, other than, I guess, sort of coming into the US election season, particularly from September onwards, then it's going to be very difficult to change that narrative. You can only do it, I suppose, if either your opponent has a similar series of either gas or something else happening, and that seems somewhat unlikely, or there is he again proves himself through Biden through something happening, and he therefore makes he makes the right decision. People say, well, actually, yes, perhaps this has always been the case, but ultimately we trust him. But I think the point, as Nancy Pelosi said, time is running very short now for the Democrats.
Jack?
Well, I've been trying to think what's comparable, and there are not very many comparable instances of a president going for a second term against an ex-president. But I do remember the '96 US election when Bill Clinton had a fairly controversial first term. Yes, he was doing some things that were in the tone of the 1990s, post-Cold War, modernizing their approach to international relations and creating jobs at home, but he was a very, very controversial president, quite divisive, and started to become mired in scandal. And his opponent in the '96 election was Senator Bob Dole, fell over in the middle of the campaign. And all it did was exemplify the fact that he was much, much older than Clinton. And Clinton was this young, modernizing, fit, agile president. And Clinton won by a landslide, despite everything that was surrounding him in terms of division and scandal. And I just think, I come back to this point, the United States electorate chooses the president that they think is going to be most consistent and strong over the next 4 years. They don't always agree with their politics, but they pick the person that they think can carry out the job most effectively. And that's what worries me most about this situation. I have so much affection and support for Joe Biden, for everything he's done over the decades, not just for beating Trump 4 years ago and for the great work he's done as president, but the time has come, and he has a duty now to himself, his family, his party, his country, and the free world to do the right thing.